Yasna 47 The Bountifulness of Ahura. As in every instance, we may have here only the fragments of a more extended piece, but also, as ever, the circumstance does not diminish the value of what remains. Although some signs of authorship apart from Zarathustra are present, the latter verses are not at all remote, so far as the period of time which they indicate is concerned from the Zarathustrian verses, and are therefore of nearly equal interest, possessing the advantage, moreover, of affording data for estimating the progress of change. 1. The Spenta Ma'in here is not identical with Ahura, but is, as so often, his spirit. It is more than possible that the memorable application of the word spenta to the seven, giving us the ameshospens, the amshospens of literature, derives its origin from the first verse here before us, or from lost verses of a similar character. All the seven seem purposely and artificially grouped here, although his spirit is, of course, not one of them. The commencing word, spenta, further attracted attention insofar as to form the theme for a sort of play upon words in the latter epilogue of Visparad 19. By means of this, his indwelling spirit, which idea or expression has probably no direct connection with the Holy Spirit of the Old and New Testaments. Well, Old Testament would be refuting what the New Testament says about not doing away with a jot or tittle of the law, but refurbishing it, right? But which, as giving the designation spirit to the ameshospens, may well have been the original seven spirits which are before the throne of God, by means of this blessed spirit, that is, in accordance with his inmost thoughts, Ahura bestows a gift upon the ideal saint. Verses 4 and 5. Upon him who works the best results for Zarathustra, Yasna 46:19, the Ratu and the Prophet, Yasna 19:6 and 8, and this gift is declared to be the inseparable two, happiness in every particular, and then both the prospect and realization of the continuance of that happiness in immortality. And these he bestows not through his immediate action, which no human intellect or susceptibility could take in unaided, but by his especially revealed benevolence, his best mind as his representative, in accordance with his plan of order and purity, pervading every moral as well as every spiritual regulation, and by the exercise of his royal power, sent forth as the archangel Kshatra, and embodied in the polity of the sacred Zarathustrian state, and this as influenced in all relations, public and domestic, by practical piety called Arama'ete, Ahura's daughter, the ready mind, the parent and family, child family language isn't literal, as we've seen. Such a revelation of the component parts of the mind and will of the deity, the simplest laboring class could understand for the moment, and for some decades, but all was, as a matter of course, soon to be overgrown with the old weeds of superstition and of myth. Well, myth doesn't mean lie, like in the Bible. That one verse that people say, well, it's saying that these are invented myths. Now, the same thing, a myth is something that has meaning and purpose. 2. Falling into detail and varying expressions, the composer prays that Ahura may carry out his holy scheme and action by the busy hands and fingers of the domestic piety, and by the preached and recited words of the good mind from the mouth and tongue of the faithful priests. So and so only would he become the father of Asha, the divine order, and of moral and ritual regularity among men. And of course, gender neutral. We're talking about all humans here, right? 3. From the discourse concerning God he arises, as so often to an address to him. That spirit, referred to in verses 1 and 2, is Ahura's own, for he is the one who makes it bounteous. And by he, we're not calling God a male. That's just the gender-neutral way. He is the bountiful one, who has created the sacred symbolic kind, the emblem and the substance of joy, representing at once the possessions of the holy people and those people themselves. And he it is who, in answer to her wail, see Yasna 29, verses 1 and 9, has spread for her the meadows of piety as arranged in the consultations, see Yasna 33, 6, made on her behalf. 4. And the spirit, as might be expected, does not confine its attention to the inspiration of piety alone. The justice of Mazda is vindicated. The wicked are afflicted under its influence, with a long wounding, see Yasna 30, verse 11, for their sins, and for their cynical preference for prosperous men, a bad dishonest character, as well as of heretical faith. 5. But he expresses his confidence that Ahura Mazda will, in the end, set all right. He will, unlike the persons just mentioned, give unto the Ashavan not Kasu alone, but Paru, not a meager share, but fullness of what is the best, while the Dregvant and the Akka, see verse 4, the faithless and the wicked, although they may be Isphano, prosperous, will only taste the enjoyment of their wealth aside from God, and therefore marred. So long as they pursue their usual course, they live in actions inspired not only by the bountiful spirit, but by the evil mind, a mind as Akka, as the person alluded to in the words Paraas, Kathe, Echo, Dragvaite in the previous verse. 6. But as ever, the moral appeals, the ascriptions of praise, lofty as they are not left without the support and service of the ritual. God will give these gifts, and which are the best, but in connection with his fire imparted to these struggling sides, see Yasna 31, verse 2, the believing and the faithless, see verses 4 and 5, through the increase of his piety and order. For that piety, as ever the instructress, will convert all those who come to her and seek her light. See Yasna 30, verse 1, Yasna 45, verse 1, nay, she will call us, all the living, to choose and believe in God. Yasna 31, 3. The first two verses here are more like the work of a disciple. The last four show, again, the original tone. It must never be forgotten, however, that later and interpolated portions are, in their sense, also original and differ but slightly in their great age from pieces more direct from the first composer. And the translation. 1. And to this man is chosen saint, Ahura Mazda will give both the two greatest gifts his, universal weal and immortality, by means of his bountiful spirit, and with his best mind from the desire to maintain his righteous moral order in word and deed, and by the strength and wisdom of his sovereign power established in piety among his folk. 2. That blessedness which is the best creation of this most bounteous spirit, Ahura Mazda will bring forth in action and words from the mouth and tongue of his good mind within his seers, and by the two hands of Armaete, his piety as she lives within the soul, and by such wise beneficence is he, the Father of the righteous order, within our worship and our lives. 3. And thou art therein, O Ahura Mazda, the bountiful one, who appertains to, and who possesses that most bounteous spirit, in that thou art he who for this man in whom the Spirit works hath made the joy-creating kind, and as to her, for her as joyful meadows of her peace wilt thou bestow thine Armaite, who is our piety as earth considered, since he, for her, hath taken counsel with thy good mind, Lord. 4. But this thy bounteous spirit doth not alone bestow rewards and blessings on the good. The wicked, foemen of the faith, are harmed, and from the motives which move that bounteous spirit of thine own, O Mazda. But not thus the saints, and yet the ruler's pride would ever slight the righteous. The feeble man alone stands free to give in kindly obligation to thy saint, but having wealth and ruling power, the evil man is at the service of the wicked, and for much. 5. That thou wilt give these gifts, and through thy most blessed and most bounteous spirit, O Ahura Mazda, to this thy Holy Spirit, for they are whatsoever is the best, but far from thy love. The wicked has his portion, abiding in the actions of the evil mind. 6. These things wilt thou give to him, O thou Ahura Mazda, and through thy bounteous spirit, and by thy fire, as in a good bestowal, the too strong thongs, through the prosperous increase of our piety, and of the righteous ritual and moral truth, for that piety of ours instructing doth teach the many coming ones who seek her face. Now, we're definitely going to finish this time. The struggle is continuing in the midst of reverses, commentary. So, 3:45. Okay, in verse 15, the immortal, the Pathali translation gives a fine suggestion in the concrete sense here. Seeing the dual abya, it explains it as referring to ha'urvatat and amer et at, which is very probably correct. So Spiegel also renders, it is very difficult to decide in which sense yang da enti no it jatius kshayamaneng vaso is to be taken. If in an evil sense, as vase kshayant is sometimes elsewhere taken, one might think of such a rendering as this: I have driven the Karpans and Kavit's disciples hence to those evil rulers, whom they, my servants, render no longer wanton tyrants over life. But these, my champion saints, shall be borne by the two to the home of thy good mind. But the strict grammar demands of us that to should refer back to yang. Accordingly, as suggested first, observe that Bohu Mana equals heaven. Recall Yasna 30 verse 4, but for the holy Vahista Mana, that is heaven. Well, things connect. But I wouldn't go that far. So in verse 16, we talk about the entire from the best one. The Pahlavi has Hum. Aryosang has Sarvam. And teaches in the wide. Reading Sak Askit, Stiaskit, the Pahlavi Amuktisno. Aryosang has Sik shapanam, otherwise syaskit, which may well mean lying, reposing, in the wide mental light of the pious or of the offering. Geldner lately admirably suggests a second suggestion. And the light of the pious, okay. If the best one is the Ratu of Yasna 33, verse 1, all is grammatically clear, but the expressions are rather strong in view of 48, verse 9, where similar language is certainly applied to Ahura. If Ahura is here meant, oh, I don't mean to squeak the chair or inhale too loudly or anything, we have only one instance more to add to the many which Ahura is spoken of in the third person, and with an address to him thrown in. See the differing views of Yasna 45, verse 11. Possibly the best one was Ahura's Sventa Ma'inu, whose wheels are my woes and doublings. Zak E. Pavan, Gumaniki, as to Ithevant seems to prove that its meaning must be calamity. Also in this place, otherwise one is strongly tempted to heed to the vigorous indication of the Pathali translator here and in Yasna 48, verse 9, he renders manifest what is clear in the midst of my doubt. The etymology would be far simpler, alternately Deva Etha is terror, or B. And, well, the last note for this, men to be sought from the harm of the wicked. Valman E. Puman Kvastar. The Pathavi seems to be desired in Ishyang. Otherwise, one might render, I will cause verbal missiles. Compare Zesta Istais, to be cast forth from the mouth for the harm of the wicked. You know, the Brahmasta and other sort of chant weapons are mentioned in the Vedic text too. Supplementary note. Parch with the drought in verse 10 may be regarded as having figurative application. The destruction of the means of irrigation so often resorted to in the same regions later would point also to a literal sense, but waste our meadows like drought is a safer expression. See the further vivapat and vi-apem equals viyapat vi-apem. And okay, where prayers, hope, and self-control. So well, in this particular, as to ceremonies, it had, at a later period, more than its share of absurdities. Well, I don't know about absurdities, just people. You know, just not things people are used to, but as to honest work, as against foraging on the enemy. There is a great difference between the Gathas and some other ancient hymns, for instance, the Riks of the Veda. In fact, these latter may be regarded as representing the opposite extreme. The Pathavi, and so also Roth, taking Mithahya as a nominative plural, you know, the kine in verse 1 here. Compare Vakahya, but I am also strongly inclined to a former view of my own. Yahya, Mithahya look irresistibly like two genitives. I would render as an emphatic alternative what fraud may lay hold of hem yasa'ete with the general reach of the one, and what seems to him the righteous deeds of the other. But if Roth and the Pahlavi are right, we have here the origin of the later Hamestaga, the souls in the intermediate place between heaven and earth, whose sins and good works have been equal. The Persian manuscript of Haug 12b has Ke, Ik, Proham, U, E, Anham, Rasid, Ested, An, E, Durug, Ke, Ik, Ham, U, An, E, Halas, Ku, Hamastan. So the Pahlavi also indicates, with the next verse here, admonishes for one's good. Val, Valman, E, Sapir, Kashishsan. Now Yosang has Uta, Masya, Va, Asva, Deyante, Dehena. And the end of the verse, the proving of Mazda, they're offering to consciousness. Literally, they are offering a gift to their own choice. There's a variant, Varena, comparing Ya, Varena. They are holding fast to the holy cause, and their vehemence in vengeance does not negate the fact that they are toiling in the love of Ahura. In Pahlavi, we have Pavan, Zak-e, Lak, Doshisno, Au, Harmazd, and Lord's kinsman in verse 3, literally with or as the kinsman. And the allied peer with the true ally. And let such a one be for us. Also in verse 3, see also 29 verse 2. Let that pasture giver, whom ye would appoint for us, teaching by example and precept, Bahu Vastrya, let him be on our sacred pastures and on our side. The Pahlavi, the good mind, well, I guess we're talking more than the end here, may be rendered as follows. He who affords increase to the righteous on account of the relationship, that is, something given to him, does so also on account of the laborer's duty or class, that is, the laborer is to be considered as his own, through the loyalty, that is, the loyal cause, that which adheres to Harmazd, he has a thorough understanding as to what is true energy towards the herds. Thus, Bahuman, a good mind, is a workman with him, to whom righteousness also belongs. And verse 4, I who will abjure all disobedience, Hubcham has dir ik von dir den unge horsam an slechten sin dirk gebet abwenden will. Observe that Hava at 2 certainly designates an upper class. Why else arrogance? Well, yeah, people see themselves as better in some way or better off in some way. Well, it's this lordly kinsman's arrogance, but yeah. But there's other reasons for it. Because if they don't know and they're saying, well, it's probably because they're rich or the ruling class or something like that. Possibly the severity. The next thing to the people was the cause of the later high reputation of Zarathustrians for veracity. And the worst care of the meadows, you know, the pasture of the kine. So they're not taking care of the meadows, and that's not good for the cows. And the Pahlavi, the crime of the stint in labor, or are we talking about the whole verse? We'll see. May be rendered him who will not listen to thee. O Harmazd, will I abjure an Ekoman also, for by him there is the despising of relations and the deception of the laboring men who live close at hand, that is, of neighbors, and he is ever bringing censure upon the clients, and he holds to the lowest measure of duty toward the herd. And the great one for help, we're on to verse 5 here. Avengane are avengane, an infinitive. The Pahlavi has avo a yari. Sra'asha is listening obedience, is the greatest for help because a matra, chant, which appeals to him, the way to Ahura is found out. See Yasna 28, verse 6, and the demon is defeated. If apano is read so strictly, and let's double make sure. Oh yeah, we're in the middle here, gaining thereby long life in the realm of the good. In verse 5, the Pahlavi translator seems to have understood apa na, baram aya finae, pavan der zi visni, zak I pavan, kuda ye I ohuman. Now Yosang has ava paya dirga yivitatva. This may well restore for us the proper text. Reading apa na, we should render obtain for us. Ahura Mazda dwells in his abode, amid the paths where his saints walk. But see, the creation is distinct from God, but God dwells amongst it, and particularly with that. Bavi Huned, Kaya probably refers to yeah. And let's look at that one. We're on to verse 6, and we're seeking with longing form. And then we move on to that best intention of mind. The Pahlavi translator seems to have seen an imperative in ava, rendering as freely iarinado. And further in that verse, what he himself, ya may be an instrumentive singular, are an accusative plural, neutral. I ask what he thought, meet, to be done. Ya does not necessarily mean equal yen in every instance. I hardly need to remind the reader that agriculture was the great question of orderly and religious life within the Zarathustrians. Without it, there was, of course, no resource but wandering and plunder for them. Well, hunting and gathering doesn't necessarily mean that a person has to plunder, but from the context of, okay, we're in verse 7, we're talking about my laws. Otherwise, see ta to e is ya in the previous verse. And the rich giver, I was formerly inclined to understand Ahura here, Indian usage permitting Indra and other entities are Bhagavan, but modern authority aided by the ancient Pahlavi translator brings me to a better mind. The Pahlavi has Pavan, Fravon, Magi. It is better to refer the word to the disciple. The more prominent members of the congregation are meant. And 8. Okay. worship be manifest among us. Now Yosang renders the last line thus: and may these offerings be manifest in the midst of us and accompanied with sincerest worship. And rouse ye and help our zeal. There are certain cases where allowance for an ancient scholar working under great disadvantages becomes a critical necessity. Here the Pahlavi translator was clearly the victim of a manuscript. The word aedum stood, as similar words so often stand in his manuscript as aedum. So, separate words, I guess. Deeply imbued with a superstitious regard for every letter. Well, the Christian doesn't like to take things literally. That's why they can accept the idea that the Jews expected God to be incarnate and that sort of thing. But with a public equally scrupulous, he saw no other course before him but to translate each as best as he could. He chose to render ae by an infinitive, preserving the root, and could only think of a form of da for doom. So also moderns in another case, many writers, seeing such a step, cast away his paper, regarding themselves as absolved by such a blunder from mastering his translations. But a little honest labor will always bring one back to sound exegesis. In the next following verse we have identically the same form and another word, which he renders awkwardly but correctly using da again, but as a proper auxiliary. And we move on. We're in verse 8, one like you. To approach the offering of a praiser seems certainly an unnatural expression. I think we are obliged to regard kshmavato in another way of saying yourself rather than of yours. And if it equals yourself here, it may also elsewhere. See Yasna 34, 2, kshmavato vahme, and also Yasna 44, 1. Neme kshmavato, all acknowledge. Mava'ete, to mean to me. Uchman kasus leher, says it 200. Das ich mit frammem Sinne an Jore Vererung Mazda gehen kann.